What I'm about to tell you happened to a 19-year-old college student named Marcus Thompson just 3 months ago. Marcus thought the university library was the safest place on campus, a quiet sanctuary where he could study without being bothered by anyone. But he was wrong, dead wrong, because something was watching him from the shadows, something that followed him between the tall bookshelves, something that grew bolder each night he stayed late to study. And when Marcus finally encountered this thing face to face, he realized he wasn't dealing with anything human at all. But this story isn't just about supernatural terror. It's about how sometimes, when we're at our lowest point, when we feel completely alone and helpless, a guardian appears exactly when we need them most. A mysterious figure who teaches us that some battles can't be fought with fear. They can only be won with faith. This is Marcus's story. And I promise you, by the end of it, you'll never look at library shadows the same way again. Marcus Thompson had always been what you might call an easy target. At 19, he was tall but skinny, with thick-rimmed glasses and the kind of nervous energy that seemed to attract bullies like moths to a flame. Throughout high school, he'd been picked on relentlessly, shoved into lockers, humiliated in front of girls he liked, made to feel like he was somehow less than everyone else. When he finally made it to Riverside University on a partial scholarship, Marcus thought those days were behind him. College was supposed to be different, right? A fresh start where nobody knew about his awkward past, where he could reinvent himself and maybe even make some friends. But within the first week of classes, Marcus realized that bullies existed at every level of education. There was Derek Morrison and his crew, entitled frat boys who seemed to take pleasure in making life miserable for anyone they deemed weird or uncool. They'd knock Marcus's books out of his hands as he walked across campus, make loud comments about his appearance when he passed by, and once even followed him back to his dorm room just to intimidate him. The worst part wasn't the actual bullying. It was the way it made Marcus feel about himself. Every cruel comment, every snicker behind his back, every time someone made him feel small and insignificant, it chipped away at what little confidence he had left. He started skipping meals at the dining hall to avoid confrontations. He stopped participating in class discussions. He even changed his route between buildings just to avoid certain areas where Derek's group liked to hang out. By October, Marcus had become almost completely isolated. His roommate barely acknowledged his existence, and the few attempts he'd made at joining clubs or study groups had ended in embarrassment. The loneliness was crushing, but it was better than being humiliated in front of people. That's when Marcus discovered the university library's 4th floor. Most students avoided the 4th floor because it housed the older academic texts, dusty volumes on philosophy, ancient history, and obscure literary criticism that rarely got checked out. The lighting was dimmer up there, and the heating system didn't work quite right, making it perpetually cold. But for Marcus, it was perfect. He could study for hours without being bothered by anyone. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of old floorboards or the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Marcus found a corner table near the philosophy section where he could spread out his textbooks and actually focus on his work without constantly looking over his shoulder. For the first time since starting college, Marcus felt safe. He began spending every evening on the 4th floor, arriving around 7 p.m. and staying until the library closed at midnight. The routine became his anchor, something stable and predictable in a life that often felt chaotic and hostile. His grades started improving, and slowly, very slowly, he began to feel like maybe he could actually succeed in college. But Marcus should have remembered that nothing good in his life ever lasted very long. It started on a Thursday night in late October. Marcus was deep into studying for his American literature midterm when he first noticed something was wrong. It was around 9:30, and the fourth floor was completely empty as usual. He was reading a particularly difficult passage from Nathaniel Hawthorne when he became aware of movement in his peripheral vision. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. When you spend hours in dim lighting, your eyes can play tricks on you. But when he looked up from his book, Marcus could have sworn he saw a dark shape ducked behind one of the tall bookshelves about 20 feet away. He stared at the spot for several minutes, waiting for someone to emerge, but nothing happened. The silence stretched on, broken only by the familiar sounds of the old building settling. Marcus shook his head and returned to his studying, convincing himself it had been nothing more than a shadow cast by the overhead lights. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Over the next hour, Marcus found himself constantly glancing up from his books, scanning the rows of shelves that surrounded his study area. Every few minutes, he'd catch a glimpse of movement, always in his peripheral vision, always just out of direct sight. When he'd turn to look, there would be nothing there. Just empty aisles and the endless rows of forgotten books. By 11 o'clock, Marcus's nerves were frayed. He couldn't concentrate on his reading anymore. Every small sound made him jump. The whisper of turning pages that seemed to come from empty sections. The soft footsteps that echoed from nowhere. The occasional creak that sounded almost like someone trying to move quietly through the stacks. When the library's closing announcement came over the intercom at 11:45, Marcus had never been so relieved to pack up his things and leave. But the next night, he came back. Because despite the unsettling experience, the fourth floor was still the only place on campus where he felt relatively safe from Derek and his friends. And besides, he told himself, it had probably just been his imagination running wild from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. Friday night started out normally enough. Marcus settled into his usual spot and opened his economics textbook, determined to put the previous evening's weirdness behind him. For the first hour, everything was fine. The fourth floor was quiet and peaceful, just like always. Then around 10:15, he heard the footsteps. They were soft, almost careful, coming from somewhere in the philosophy section behind him. Marcus froze, his pen hovering over his notebook. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, as if someone was trying very hard not to make noise, but not quite succeeding. "Hello?" Marcus called out, his voice sounding small and uncertain in the vast space. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately. Marcus waited, straining his ears for any sound. But the silence that followed was somehow worse than the mysterious footsteps had been. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, pregnant with unseen presence and hidden threats. After several minutes of waiting, Marcus tried to return to his studying, but his concentration was completely shot. Every few minutes he'd hear something, the soft scrape of a book being moved, the whisper of pages turning, the gentle creak of floorboards under careful feet. But whenever he'd look up or call out, the sounds would stop immediately. By the third night, Marcus was beginning to seriously question his sanity. Saturday evening brought with it a sense of dread that Marcus couldn't shake. He almost didn't go to the library at all, but his economics exam was on Monday, and he desperately needed the study time. So at 7 p.m., he reluctantly climbed the stairs to the fourth floor, telling himself that he'd just study for a couple hours and leave early. But this time, whatever was stalking him had grown bolder. Marcus had been studying for maybe an hour when he saw it clearly for the first time. He was looking down at his textbook when a movement directly across from him caught his attention. When he raised his eyes, his blood turned to ice in his veins. There, standing between two tall bookshelves about 15 feet away, was a figure. It was human-shaped, but wrong in every conceivable way. Tall and impossibly thin, it seemed to be made of living shadow rather than flesh and bone. Where its face should have been was just an empty void, darker than the surrounding darkness. Its arms hung at unnatural angles, and when it moved, it did so with a fluid, boneless motion that made Marcus's stomach turn. The worst part was that it was staring directly at him. Even though it had no visible eyes, Marcus could feel its attention, like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. They looked at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, without warning, the shadow figure glided sideways behind the bookshelf and disappeared from view. Marcus shot to his feet so quickly that his chair fell backward with a loud crash. His hands were shaking as he grabbed his books and backpack, not bothering to organize them properly. All he wanted was to get out of there as fast as possible. But as he hurried toward the stairwell, he became aware that he wasn't alone. There were more of them. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see dark shapes moving between the bookshelves, keeping pace with him as he walked. They stayed just out of direct sight, but he could sense them there. A whole group of shadow figures following his every move. Marcus broke into a run, his footsteps echoing loudly in the silence as he sprinted toward the stairs. Behind him, he could hear something that might have been laughter, a sound like wind through dead leaves, hollow and mocking. He didn't stop running until he was back in his dorm room with the door locked and every light in the room turned on. Sunday night, Marcus didn't go to the library at all. He tried to study in his room, but he couldn't concentrate. Every shadow seemed threatening. Every small noise made him jump. His roommate asked if he was okay, and Marcus almost broke down and told him everything. But how do you explain something like that? How do you tell someone that you're being stalked by creatures made of living darkness? By Monday morning, Marcus was exhausted and anxious. He bombed his economics exam, barely able to focus on the questions because he kept glancing at the shadows in the corners of the classroom. Derek Morrison and his friends noticed his obviously rattled state and took advantage of it, making snide comments about his appearance and laughing when he dropped his papers outside the lecture hall. That evening, Marcus faced a terrible choice. He could continue avoiding the fourth floor and watch his grades suffer, or he could go back and face whatever was waiting for him there. His academic future won out over his fear. Barely. Tuesday night, Marcus climbed the stairs to the fourth floor with his heart pounding and his hands slick with sweat. He'd spent the entire day trying to convince himself that the shadow figures had been hallucinations brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. As soon as he stepped onto the fourth floor, he could feel them watching him. The shadow people were there, lurking just out of sight between the bookshelves. Marcus could sense their presence like a low electric hum in the air. His hands trembled as he made his way to his usual study spot, trying to act like everything was normal. But it wasn't normal. It wasn't normal at all. Tonight, they weren't content to just watch from a distance. As Marcus tried to study, the shadow figures grew bolder, moving closer to his table. He could see them in his peripheral vision, dark shapes that seemed to absorb the already dim light around them. They moved with that same unnatural fluidity he'd observed before, like smoke given form and malevolent purpose. By 9 o'clock, Marcus was a nervous wreck. His economics textbook lay open in front of him. But he hadn't absorbed a single word in the past hour. The shadow people were everywhere now, surrounding his table in a loose circle. Some stood motionless between the bookshelves, while others glided slowly back and forth along the aisles, never coming close enough for him to get a clear look, but never letting him forget they were there. The temperature in the room seemed to have dropped by 20 degrees. Marcus's breath was coming out in small puffs of vapor, and his fingers were numb with cold. The overhead lights flickered occasionally, casting dancing shadows that made it even harder to distinguish between normal darkness and the supernatural entities stalking him. Then, at exactly 9:30, everything changed. Marcus heard footsteps coming up the stairwell. Real footsteps, heavy and purposeful, nothing like the whisper-soft movements of the shadow people. A moment later, an elderly man emerged onto the fourth floor, pushing a janitor's cart loaded with cleaning supplies. The man was probably in his 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a simple gray uniform with a name tag that read Joseph, and moved with the slow, careful gait of someone who'd been doing manual labor for most of his life. But here was the strange thing. The moment the Guardian appeared, every single shadow figure vanished. It wasn't gradual. 1 second they were there, pressing in on Marcus from all sides, and the next second they were gone, as if they'd never existed at all. The temperature in the room immediately began to return to normal, and the oppressive feeling of being watched lifted like a weight being removed from Marcus's shoulders. Joseph began working his way through the fourth floor, emptying trash cans and occasionally straightening books on the shelves. When he reached Marcus's section, he looked up and smiled. "Evening, son," he said in a voice that was warm and gravelly. "Studying hard, I see." "Yes, sir," Marcus stammered, still in shock from the sudden disappearance of his supernatural stalkers. "Just trying to catch up on some reading." Joseph nodded and continued his work, but after a few minutes he paused and looked directly at Marcus. There was something in the old man's eyes, a depth of understanding that seemed impossible for someone he'd just met. "You know," the Guardian said quietly, remaining in the shadows where his face was partially obscured. "I've been working in this library for more than 40 years. Seen all kinds of things in that time. This old building has quite a history." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of things?" The old man leaned on his mop handle and seemed to consider his words carefully. "Well, there are some folks who say the fourth floor is haunted. Stories about dark figures that show up when someone's feeling lost or afraid. They feed off fear, you see. The more scared you get, the stronger they become. That's just superstition, right?" Marcus asked, though his voice lacked conviction. The old custodian smiled, but there was nothing condescending about it. "Maybe. Or maybe there are more things in this world than most people want to believe. Either way, I found that the best defense against that kind of darkness isn't running away." "What is it then?" "Faith, son. Not necessarily religious faith, though that works too, but faith in yourself. Faith that you're stronger than you think you are. See, those shadow things, if they do exist, they can only hurt you if you let them. Fear gives them power. But courage? Courage makes them weak." The Guardian returned to his cleaning, but he continued talking as he worked. "I knew a young man once, probably about your age. He was having a hard time with some bullies at school. Felt like the whole world was against him. Started seeing things in the dark corners. Started believing he was powerless." Marcus leaned forward, hanging on every word. "But then someone taught him something important," the old man continued. "Taught him that the things we're most afraid of, whether they're supernatural or just other people being cruel, They only have as much power over us as we give them. Sometimes you have to stand up to the darkness, literal or otherwise. But what if you're not strong enough? Marcus asked quietly. The Guardian stopped cleaning and looked directly at him, though his face remained largely hidden in the shadows. Son, strength isn't about how big you are or how tough you act. Real strength comes from knowing that you're not fighting alone. There's always someone watching over you, even when you can't see them. As if to emphasize his point, the old man glanced toward the shadows between the bookshelves, where the dark figures had been lurking just minutes before. Sometimes you just have to trust that you're protected and find the courage to face whatever's trying to scare you. The conversation with the Guardian left Marcus feeling strangely calm for the first time in days. The old custodian finished his cleaning and headed back downstairs, but not before giving Marcus an encouraging nod and saying, "Remember what I told you, son? You're stronger than you think." For the next hour, Marcus actually managed to study productively. The fourth floor remained peacefully quiet, and he found himself absorbing information from his textbooks for the first time in weeks. It was as if the Guardian's presence had cleansed the space of whatever dark energy had been plaguing it. But Marcus knew the real test would come when he was alone again. Around 11 o'clock, he heard the familiar whisper of movement in the shadows. The shadow people were back, emerging from whatever dimension they retreated to when the Guardian was around. But this time, Marcus didn't panic. Instead, he remembered the old man's words about faith and courage. When the first shadow figure appeared between the bookshelves, Marcus looked directly at it, instead of averting his eyes. "I see you," he said quietly. "But I'm not afraid anymore." The shadows seemed to hesitate, as if it wasn't used to being addressed directly. More figures emerged from the darkness, surrounding Marcus's table, just as they had before. But instead of the overwhelming terror he'd felt previously, Marcus found himself filled with a strange sense of determination. "You feed off fear, don't you?" he said, standing up from his chair. "That's why you're here." "Because I've been scared for so long. Scared of Derek and his friends, scared of being alone, scared of failing. But I'm done being afraid." The shadow figures pressed closer, but Marcus held his ground. He thought about Joseph's words, about being protected even when he couldn't see it, about having the strength to face the darkness. "I don't know what you are or where you come from," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "But you don't belong here, and you don't have power over me anymore." For a moment, nothing happened. The shadow people remained motionless, as if they were waiting for his resolve to crack. But Marcus stood firm, drawing on a wellspring of courage he hadn't known he possessed. Then, one by one, the shadow figures began to fade away. They didn't flee or retreat. They simply dissolved, becoming less solid until they were nothing more than ordinary shadows cast by the library's dim lighting. The oppressive atmosphere that had plagued the fourth floor for days lifted completely, leaving behind only the peaceful quiet that Marcus had originally fallen in love with. The next morning brought another test of Marcus's newfound courage, but this one was entirely human. Derek Morrison and his crew cornered Marcus outside the dining hall, clearly planning their usual routine of intimidation and humiliation. Derek grabbed Marcus's backpack and dumped the contents on the ground, while his friends laughed and made crude comments. In the past, Marcus would have just taken it. He would have quietly picked up his things and hurried away, burning with shame and helplessness. But something had changed during his encounter with the shadow people. If he could face supernatural entities made of living fear, he could certainly handle a group of immature bullies. "Pick it up," Marcus said calmly, looking Derek directly in the eye. Derek blinked, clearly not expecting this reaction. "What did you say to me?" I said, pick it up. You made the mess. You clean it up. A crowd was starting to gather, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. Derek's friends exchanged uncertain glances, unsure how to respond to this unexpected defiance. You think you're tough now, freak? Derek sneered. But there was something forced about his bravado. I think I'm tired of being pushed around, Marcus replied steadily. And I think you're going to pick up my things and apologize, or we're going to have a problem. Derek took a step forward, trying to intimidate Marcus with his superior size, but Marcus didn't back down. He'd faced something far more terrifying than a college bully, and the experience had shown him that most threats were hollow when you refused to be afraid of them. You know what? Derek said after a long moment, glancing around at the crowd of students watching the confrontation. You're not worth it. He walked away without another word, his friends trailing behind him like confused sheep. Marcus calmly picked up his scattered belongings, aware that several students were looking at him with new respect. From that day forward, Derek and his crew left Marcus alone. Word spread quickly around campus that the quiet kid from the library had finally stood up for himself, and bullies always preferred easy targets to those who might fight back. 2 weeks later, Marcus was back to his regular routine of studying on the 4th floor. The shadow people never returned, and he'd settled into a comfortable rhythm of productive study sessions and steadily improving grades. But there was one thing that bothered him. He hadn't seen the Guardian since that crucial night when everything changed. Marcus had looked for the elderly custodian several times, staying late specifically to catch him during his cleaning rounds. But the 4th floor was always cleaned by different staff members. Younger people he didn't recognize. When he finally worked up the courage to ask about it, he approached the main circulation desk. Excuse me, he said to the librarian on duty. I was wondering if you could tell me when Joseph works. The janitor who cleans the 4th floor. I saw his name tag. The librarian looked confused. Joseph? I'm sorry, but we don't have any janitors named Joseph on our staff. The 4th floor is handled by our evening crew, Maria and Tom. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. But I talked to him. He was an older man, gray hair, wore a baseball cap and uniform with a name tag that said Joseph. This was about 2 weeks ago. The librarian shook her head. I've been working here for 5 years, and I know all our custodial staff. There's definitely no one by that name or description. Could you check the security cameras? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. October 30th, around 9:30 p.m., 4th floor? The librarian seemed hesitant, but something in Marcus's expression convinced her to help. She led him to a small office behind the circulation desk, where she pulled up the security footage on her computer. Here we go, she said, scrolling to the correct date and time. 4th floor, October 30th, 9:30 p.m. On the screen, Marcus watched himself sitting at his usual table, looking around nervously at empty space. He saw himself stand up suddenly, as if someone had just entered the room and then begin having what appeared to be a one-sided conversation with thin air. There was no elderly janitor. There was no cart full of cleaning supplies. There was just Marcus talking animatedly to absolutely nothing for nearly an hour. I don't understand, Marcus whispered, staring at the screen in shock. The librarian gave him a concerned look. Are you feeling all right? Maybe you should talk to someone at the counseling center. But Marcus barely heard her. He was remembering the Guardian's words about faith, about being protected even when you couldn't see it, about not fighting alone. He thought about the shadow people disappearing the moment the old custodian arrived, about the courage he'd found to face both supernatural and human threats. As he walked back across campus to his dorm, Marcus found himself smiling despite his confusion. He didn't know who or what the guardian had been. Maybe it had been his imagination, some kind of psychological manifestation of his own need for guidance and support. Or maybe it had been something else entirely, something that existed beyond the reach of security cameras and rational explanation. Either way, the encounter had changed his life. He was no longer the frightened, isolated young man who'd been terrorized by both supernatural entities and human bullies. He'd found his courage, and with it, a sense of peace he'd never experienced before. That night, as Marcus settled into his usual spot on the 4th floor, he looked around at the shadows between the bookshelves and felt only calm. Whatever darkness had once lurked there was gone, replaced by the comforting presence of ordinary shadows and quiet study space. "Thank you," he whispered to the empty air, just in case someone was listening. And for just a moment, Marcus could have sworn he felt a gentle hand rest briefly on his shoulder before the sensation faded, leaving behind only warmth and the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged.